We have a copy of the statement. It does speak for itself. Let me just start off with something simple. Do we now understand what's causing inflation there in the Philippines?
Hi, David. Good morning. Our assessment is still basically inflation is being triggered at the first round by some supply-side shocks, including especially higher oil prices. However, we are seeing a broadening of the inflation pressures as well as rising expectations. And on that basis, the BSP has moved on a tightening course to control and anchor inflationary expectations.
Now, I know the central bank doesn't target specific levels for the exchange rate governor. Equally, though, when you ask analysts, they're pointing to the weak currency as being the main driver or one of the main drivers of inflation. Would the central bank concede that or acknowledge that the Philippine peso might just be too weak at the moment?
The flexibility of the peso is part and parcel of our monetary strategy. As you know, if you look at the fundamentals, the Philippines actually is running a broader trade deficit, and part of the adjustment process is for the peso to, in fact, adjust to that. What the BSP is monitoring closely is excessive volatility, and that's what we're potentially addressing as well with the recent rate hikes.
Right. Now, the next meeting is on the 27th of September from the Monetary Board. Now, you've promised more action if needed. There's one inflation release before that on the 5th of September. Assuming inflation continues to move up, are you prepared to take further action as early as your next meeting?
We have not closed the door to that, David. But as you know, we do expect the inflation to potentially peak perhaps by next month. So we will have to assess that piece of information. But not only that information, we will have to revisit our forecast horizon and act on that basis. So we will be very data dependent on our next policy move.
Now, in terms of the discussion surrounding the inflation, I'm just curious, Governor, and tell me, was an interim or off-schedule meeting ever considered these last 2 months because of what a lot of people consider really shockingly high inflation there in the Philippines?
Well, we discussed that at the Monetary Board, but the Monetary Board decided that it's better to stick to our schedule because while the inflation outlook raises concerns, we don't see it as something that we need to respond with an off-cycle adjustment. So we're basically sticking to that course of action.
Now, in terms of growth, we've averaged, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, 6.5% for GDP these last, 6 years or so. I know you don't expect the current rate hikes that you put in place to drag on the economy, but there will be a lag, of course, and when that eventually does kick in, when does the central bank expect the drag to show up in GDP numbers?
Well, David, I think first and foremost, we need to understand the recent number that was put out on GDP, which represents a lower number at 6%. But a lot of that has something to do as well with agricultural production, and to some extent that's also driving inflationary dynamics. That's something that is related to weather as well. And we think, based on our assessment, that our instruments take effect over a 2-year horizon. So we think that there will be recovery in growth, especially with a strong investment drive of government on build. So I think there's enough sources of domestic demand to keep growth at a high level.
Governor, monetary policy is seen as the cure-all for all sorts of ailments in economies these days. Do you think enough is being done on the fiscal side?
Yes, the fiscal side, not that many countries are actually going for tax reform. So this government has already pushed forward with the first stage of a major tax overhaul, which is generating significant revenue yield. So I think this government is very committed to a 3% GDP deficit, and that's going to be part and parcel of the stability of the macro situation in the Philippines.
Okay, and we've had criticism from the International Monetary Fund saying that you may have had communication challenges. What do you think they meant by that? And if you have a clear understanding of what they meant by that. Do you think you've addressed it with the latest statement that David was reading from earlier?
In our statement, I think our recent action is very clear in terms of the BSP's commitment to its primary mandate of promoting price stability. I think we haven't done 50 basis points in a long while, and the recent action to do 50 basis points basically emphasizes that our primary focus is inflation.
Now, Governor, we've heard prior to, or at least in the lead up to this meeting, from different members of the administration, lawmakers as well, calling for a rate hike. Now, I know I asked you this before when we were speaking last in Tokyo, but I'll ask you this again in light of the optics. Do you think comments or those types of comments encroach on the central bank's independence?
Well, we cannot stop people from making their own comments, but the BSP is driven by its, objectively by its own mandate and looking at the data. So we have been on a tightening course, actually. We have already done, prior to the 50 basis points, 25 basis points hikes. And even before the announcement, I did say that we were preparing, or I was preparing the market for strong monetary action, and we delivered yesterday.
Governor, how do you prepare for this trade war? How do you think the Philippines will be affected by it, and what measures are you taking?
Well, part of the measures that we are taking is that we are making sure that our own macro fundamentals are in order, and that means keeping the fiscal program on target, and that also means keeping our house in order with respect to inflationary pressure. So that's a way of reducing our own vulnerability. And let me also say that we have built up quite a bit of buffers against this uncertainty coming from outside. So we've got a huge level of reserves right now, and we have built up trade relations across ASEAN area, so we do have options.
Governor, final question, and I hope you don't mind me asking about your health. Have you fully recovered, and how are you recently?
I'm actually much, much better now, David. As you know, the illness that I had takes a bit of time to fully recover. And, I will be on monitor for the next couple of years to see if nothing else deteriorates. But for now, I'm up and about and doing very well.